Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of Gravitas. I'm Molly Gambhir. Let's get started. For 12 days now, major Ukrainian cities have borne the brunt of a full-scale Russian attack. 350 civilians killed, and that's just the official figure. For days now, the Ukrainian president has been appealing for more military support. He says if NATO cannot seal off the Ukrainian airspace by imposing a no-fly zone, it should give Ukraine more air power. On Gravitas tonight, we get you ground reports from Ukraine as it fights the Russian invasion. We also discuss why the Ukrainian president has issued a pointed warning to NATO, saying the alliance will be responsible for Ukrainian casualties. We also examine the far-reaching global implications of the Russia-Ukraine war, the ripple effect on the oil markets, and discuss the impact this war will have on the global economy.
Население.
This is day 12 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The global community is cornering the Kremlin. More than 40 companies have pulled out of Russia. The West is mulling more sanctions, but the Russian president has no plans to de-escalate. Major Ukrainian cities are bearing the brunt of Russia's aggression. Look at this. This is Kyiv, the second largest city of Ukraine. Since last week, the Russian forces have relentlessly bombed Kyiv, and this is what the city looks like today.
Смотрите, сколько военных.
Это вот это, что мы видели, да? Даже нам оттуда было видно. А что ж это за здание было? Это что?
Civilians are coming in the line of fire. The United Nations says more than 350 civilians have been killed in Ukraine so far. 350 innocent lives lost, and this is just the official figure. The actual death toll is much higher. The Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has vowed revenge. What options does he have? So far, the resilient Ukrainian forces have managed to contain the mighty Russian army, but can they overcome Russia? On Gravitas tonight, we discuss. Let's start with what happened in Irpin over the weekend. Irpin is a town near the capital city of Kyiv. A large number of people have been leaving from here. Civilians have come under attack. What I'm about to show you is graphic. This video came out yesterday. On your screen now is a street in Irpin. Some reporters are trying to speak to a local. Look carefully now. Behind that man, some people are trying to leave the town. What happened next is truly shocking.
Що вчора було з дітьми, кажеш?
Погано було. Дітей 200-х вивозили, мирне населення, маленькі. Смотрите его!
Стоять!
All right.
A rocket came out of nowhere and fell on a family. 3 civilians died in this strike alone. The ceasefire for the safe passage of refugees is not working. Key cities remain encircled. Russia announced humanitarian corridors to transport Ukrainians, but Kyiv has termed the move completely immoral. Ukraine says these corridors are a stunt designed to show Moscow in a good light. Ukraine is also blaming Russia for attacking civilians. Volodymyr Zelensky is outraged. The Ukrainian president has issued a warning to Moscow. He said there will be no forgiveness and Russian forces will face a day of judgment.
Ми не пробачимо розстріляних житлових будинків. Ми не пробачимо ракету, яку наша протиповітряна оборона збила сьогодні над Охмаддітом. І ще більше 500 інших таких ракет, які вдарили по нашій землі.
Strong words there from President Zelensky, who are angry like him, like the locals in Kherson. Kherson was captured by the Russian forces last week. The locals there are now taking to the streets. This video emerged a few days back. The residents of the city took out a demonstration against Russian occupation. So there is a strong anti-Russia sentiment in Ukraine. The people of Ukraine are supporting their armed forces. They want to fight the Russians. But that does not bother Vladimir Putin. The Russian president has refused to de-escalate. He has vowed to press ahead with his offensive. Yesterday, the Kremlin issued a comment from President Putin. It says, I'm quoting now, it was underlined that the suspension of this special operation is only possible if Kyiv stops military operations and carries out well-known Russian demands. To put it simply, Moscow wants Ukraine to lay down its arms. Kyiv has rejected these demands. Ukraine is hitting back. It wants to embarrass Russia wherever it can. Kyiv has taken the conflict to the International Court of Justice. The Ukrainian government has appealed to the ICJ. It is seeking an immediate stop to the Russian invasion. That hearing was today and Russia decided to skip it. Moscow sent no representatives to the International Court of Justice. Empty chairs represented Russia at The Hague. The hearings began despite the absence of Russia. They will continue tomorrow. So will the dialogue. The foreign ministers of Russia and Ukraine will be meeting this week. Turkey is playing mediator for these talks. It will host the foreign ministers in Antalya. So far, Russia and Ukraine have held 2 rounds of dialogue with a 3rd round today. So far, no signals towards a truce. But the global community is increasingly pushing Moscow and Kyiv to end this conflict through dialogue. And this includes India. The Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, spoke to both Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin. He thanked Zelensky for Ukraine's help in the evacuation of Indian students. Speaking to Putin, Prime Minister Modi pressed for the safe evacuation of the Indian students in Sumy. Some of them are still stranded there. Russian forces have encircled Sumy. The city is facing heavy shelling. So what was the Russian president's response? Once again, he claimed that Indian students were held up by radicals in Kharkiv. Earlier, remember, Russia had claimed Indian students were taken hostage in Ukraine, and India had denied these claims. New Delhi had said it received no reports of any hostage situation. Today, Prime Minister Modi asked Vladimir Putin to hold direct talks with Volodymyr Zelensky, something that Putin has refused to do so far. Meanwhile, Russia is on a slow march towards Kyiv. Its missiles are targeting Ukrainian defenses. Its aircraft are taking out Ukrainian positions. Gradually, Russia's air superiority is coming to the fore. So does Ukraine have a plan to counter it? It does. It's called a no-fly zone. President Zelensky is adamant about it. He wants NATO to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine. First of all, what exactly is a no-fly zone? Think of it as a no-entry sign in the air. enemy aircraft will not be permitted to enter the no-fly zones, and if they do, there will be retaliation. They can be warned, they can be escorted away, and in the worst-case scenario, they can be shot down. And Zelensky wants NATO to impose this no-fly zone over Ukraine, basically stop Russian jets from flying in. But there is just one problem here. NATO is simply not interested. And why is that? The problem with a no-fly zone is implementing it. Let's assume NATO does close off Ukrainian airspace. What happens if Russian jets violate it? NATO pilots will go nose to nose with Russian jets.
The only way to actually implement something like a no-fly zone is to send NATO planes into Ukrainian airspace and to shoot down Russian planes, and that could lead to a full-fledged war in Europe. President Biden has been clear that we are not going to get into a war with Russia, but we are going to tremendous lengths with allies and partners to provide Ukrainians with the means to effectively defend themselves.
So NATO wants to contain the war. It has no intention of escalating it. This may seem like the rational choice here, but Volodymyr Zelensky is a desperate leader right now. He needs all the military support that he can get, and which is why he lashed out at NATO's decision. Zelensky's words were pointed. He said NATO would be responsible for any Ukrainian casualties in the future.
Today was the NATO summit, a weak summit, a confused summit, a summit that shows that not everyone considers the fight for freedom in Europe to be the #1 goal. And what did you think about during that meeting? People who die from now on will also die because of you, because of your weakness, because of your disunity.
He is not mincing his words. And remember, NATO is Zelensky's biggest ally, his best hope to repel Russian soldiers. So what does this tell you about Ukraine's position? 1, the Russian advance may be slow, but it is relentless. And 2, Ukraine overestimated NATO's commitment. Diplomatically, the alliance has been isolating Russia. Financially, the sanctions have been imposed. But what about military support? That is where Ukraine was counting on more NATO assistance. Does that mean NATO should impose a no-fly zone? Most experts say no. Russia versus Ukraine is a conventional war. Russia versus NATO has echoes of a nuclear war. More countries will be dragged in, more soldiers, more weapons. The Russian president had this warning for the Western leaders. Listen in.
Now we are hearing that a no-fly zone must be established over the territory of Ukraine. It is impossible to do so over the territory of Ukraine itself. It is possible only from the territory of some neighboring countries. But any move in this direction will be viewed by us as a participation in the armed conflict of whichever side whose territory will pose a threat to our service members. That very second, we will view them as participants of the military conflict, and it would not matter what members they are.
And that is a clear message from Putin. If you impose a no-fly zone, you are joining the war. And right now, NATO does not want to be a part of this war, clearly. So what options does the alliance have? 1 is to prop up Ukraine's own air defense. How can they do that? By providing more fighter jets, by sending more missile systems. NATO seems to be moving in that direction. Last month, the European Union promised to send fighter jets to Ukraine. Ukrainian pilots were dispatched to fly the jets. But suddenly, the deal stalled. The fighter jets remained grounded. It took another appeal from Volodymyr Zelensky to grease the wheels. This time, his temperament was different. He said, if you cannot impose a no-fly zone, at least send your jets.
The world is strong enough to close our skies to Russian missiles, fighter jets and helicopters. But if someone still has doubts, then Ukraine needs planes. It's easy actually when you have the will in order to make Ukraine and European skies safe.
Щоб зробити небо безпечним, небо України, небо Європи.
And the obvious candidate to provide these planes is Poland. It has a fleet of Soviet-made MiG fighters. Ukrainian pilots have flown them before, so no additional training will be required. But there is one problem. If Poland offers these jets, its air force will become weaker. And with Russia marching through Ukraine, it will worry Poland. So what is the solution? America could fill the gap in Poland's air force, basically replace the MiG fighters that are given to Ukraine. American media is reporting a three-way deal. Poland gives MiG fighters to Ukraine and the US gives F-16 jets to Poland.
We are we're looking actively now at the question of airplanes that Poland may provide to Ukraine, and looking at how we might be able to backfill should Poland decide to produce those, supply those planes.
This seems to be NATO's game plan. Flood Ukraine with lethal military aid, missiles, jets, air defense systems. In less than a week, the US has shipped 17,000 anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. They have a fixed route, airlift to Poland and Romania, and transport by road into Ukraine. This is a long-term strategy. For starters, it will delay Russia's victory, increase the cost of war, and secondly, it lays the ground for any insurgency. Even if Ukraine loses, the Western weapons will fuel resistance. The question is, could this backfire? Will Russia see this as NATO entering the war? It is certainly possible. We just showed you Vladimir Putin's warning on imposing a no-fly zone. He had something similar to say on sanctions.
By the way, these sanctions that are being imposed, they are akin to declaring war. But thank God we haven't gotten there yet. I think our so-called quote-unquote partners still have an understanding of what the ramifications and threats to everybody could be.
This is a tightrope for both NATO and Russia. If Vladimir Putin retaliates, NATO will activate Article 5 of its charter. All 30 NATO members will declare war on Russia. Mercurial as he is, Putin will not risk that. As for NATO, their military assistance is extremely risky. They cannot meddle beyond a point. And if they do, Russia will escalate the war. Let's now head straight to the heart of action, the capitals that are shaping this war. Joining me are WION's correspondents, Anas Malik from Kyiv, Simon Marks with us from Washington, D.C., and Rosie Bichard from Brussels. Anas, let me come to you first. Tell us about the situation in Kyiv right now. You have been speaking to the locals as well. What have they been telling you?
Well, Molly, this is more of a ghost town right now. Lesser people on the road, lesser cars on the road, 6 p.m. curfew, only supermarkets, that too selected supermarkets open, cafes closed, pubs closed, other shops have been closed. So that explains the situation here in Kyiv right now. Now, just to give you an account, there have been shelling that has been heard in the distance, and just before I went for this live, literally just minutes before, the city administration, the Kyiv city administration has confirmed that as a result of Russian shelling, just a while back, we earlier heard two big bangs or two big booms in the outskirts of the city. The city administration has confirmed that 13 people have lost their lives or gotten injured in Markhiv area, that is towards the western side of Kyiv. It's in the outskirts, but in the western side of the city. That goes on to explain the situation currently that Kyiv is going through or is bracing for. There are more and more military convoys on the road, more and more checkposts on the road, stringent checking that has been done, and you are being asked to carry all of your identification documents as well. The people here, they are angry at the international governments, at the international community. They are in support of their government, but at the same time, they are a bit skeptical with regards to this new rule or this unsaid law per se, which basically bars people from 18 to 60 to travel abroad. Molly?
Right, Anas, tell us about the Russian troop advancement towards Kyiv and the military gains that Russia has made over the weekend.
Well, the Russian troops are literally around at the gates of Kyiv. It won't be wrong to say they're just 27 kilometers from here in Irpin, where the war has been ongoing, where the fighting has been ongoing, and fighting has been at street-to-street level, quite literally. It's just 27 kilometers from Kyiv. As I talk to you, we just heard another boom. It's again in the distance, so you don't know where this, what this boom was. But presumably this was one of those again from the shelling that is being done. Coming back to your answer to your question, so the Russian troops advancement have been done. We're seeing that Kyiv has been fortified by the military, by volunteers. As I said, it's more of a ghost town, and it gives that feel of that calm before the storm. Molly?
And as we're leaving it there for the moment, thanks very much for helping us better understand the ground situation in Kyiv. Stay safe. Simon, if I can come to you now, Volodymyr Zelensky earlier dialed the American president. Tell us about the conversation that the two leaders had and what further assistance America is mulling at this point.
Well, this is a series of conversations that has been underway between President Zelensky and President Joe Biden. Also notable that President Zelensky held a video conference on Saturday with members of the United States Senate, and that seems to have been very significant in terms of resulting in members of Congress on Capitol Hill putting added pressure on President Biden to take more stringent actions towards Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. What the Ukrainian president has been calling for days now is the implementation of a no-fly zone. As we've already said on the programme, there is no prospect of that happening because the Biden administration believes that that would put America and NATO on the slippery slope to a direct conflict with Russia that President Vladimir Putin and his senior lieutenants have all indicated could go nuclear. So the ideas that are currently on the table are, first of all, this concept of encouraging Poland to provide fighter jets to Ukraine, not the pilots, just the jets, and then the United States would replace those planes, backfill, in other words, the jets that get sent to Ukraine to assist in Ukraine's air defences. The Russians have already indicated that they see that as tantamount to tantamount to creating, in essence, a declaration of war by the West on Russia. So it's going to be interesting to see how that advances. The other idea that is fervently on the table here now is banning Russian oil imports. And we've seen the White House move strenuously over the last few hours to prepare the American public for that eventuality and the inevitable increase in fuel prices at petrol pumps from coast to coast.
We earlier played out that pointed warning from Volodymyr Zelensky for NATO, saying that the alliance will be held responsible for Ukrainian casualties over its refusal to impose a no-fly zone. We have already established what the NATO's position is on this front. But any reaction from the White House, from the United States leadership when it comes to the appeals from Zelensky and the concern that has been raised by the Ukrainian leadership over the consequences that this decision could have?
Look, I think there's no question that President Zelensky's presentation on Saturday to members of the Senate had an impact, particularly, we are told, when he said to them, I may never see you again. I may not be alive to have another conversation with you. And that apparently concentrated the minds of those senators who were on the call. But for the United States, at the end of the day, the line remains the one between NATO and Russia. They don't want to do anything that is going to see NATO directly in conflict with Russia, even if that is at the risk, ultimately, of losing Ukraine. And one of the difficulties that the Biden administration is facing is that these harrowing pictures, I mean, if you look today at the front of the New York Times, which I've got right here, you know, right above the fold, the New York Times with the picture taken by its own photographer yesterday in Irpin of those civilians who were killed by the Russians after the Russians failed to observe the ceasefire, to allow the creation of humanitarian corridors. News coverage like that is beginning to impact public opinion here, which is why we're seeing now a majority of Americans saying they would favour banning Russian oil imports, even though the price of petrol in some parts of the country is already hitting, for the modern era, record levels.
Right. Thanks very much, Simon, for those inputs and perspectives. Now, Rosie, coming to you, Volodymyr Zelensky wants the NATO to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Reports say NATO is not in favor of that decision. What more can you tell us about this?
Well, so far for NATO, a no-fly zone has been an absolute no-go. And the main reason for that is that NATO says having a no-fly zone or initiating a no-fly zone would mean shooting down Russian planes, and that would mean essentially going to war with Russia. And the NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg says that would lead to an even bigger war and even greater human suffering. However, we do know that the United States is in discussions with Poland on a potential to transfer military aircraft into Ukraine for Ukrainian pilots to use. So NATO allies have been willing and remain willing to share weapons with Ukraine, including lethal weapons. But so far, that no-fly zone remains off the table. And the key reason there is that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And that means it's not party to the alliance's collective defence pledge known as Article 5, whereby any NATO ally whose security is threatened can expect defensive support from the others.
Rosie Bishop getting us those inputs from Brussels. WION has been reporting from the front lines of the Russia-Ukraine war. Our correspondent Anas Malik is on ground zero. He has documented his near 10-hour-long journey as he made his way from the West Ukrainian city of Lviv to the capital, Kyiv. Take a look.
At the Lviv railway station in the western city of Ukraine, thousands of volunteers form chains to pass on relief items into a train. The relief items include milk cartons, medicines, water bottles, and other essential items to keep the city running. The city is under heavy attack by the Russian forces. It has been surrounded, and train travel is considered the safest way into the city of Kyiv, which is the capital of Ukraine.
Once bustling with travelers and smiles, this architectural marvel, the Lviv railway station, has become a transit hub for millions of helpless Ukrainians fleeing a war at home. Trains filled with people from across the country continue to come in. The arrival platforms are packed with people, but the trains making their journey back run empty. We made our journey from Lviv to Kyiv on one of the trains directly connecting the two cities.
So I'm currently on board the train from Lviv to Kyiv, which is full of necessities, everyday amenities and goods. But what is to be noted is the fact that this train is literally empty. There are 12 compartments in this section, and all of them, except for one that I have boarded, none of them have any passengers. This train is mostly being used by passengers to come into Lviv city from Kyiv or elsewhere in the country, so that they can be considerably safe and then use this city as a transit route to go onwards to Poland, Hungary or other parts of the European countries.
In normal times, these coaches would be packed with people. But now, with Russia's assault going strong across the country, the almost empty trains make their way cautiously.
The train journey usually takes about 7 hours if it's a direct train. If it's not, if it has stopovers, it goes through intercity, then it can take up to 11 hours. But this direct train, firstly, it was delayed by about an hour and a half, and currently its arrival is also delayed by about 3 hours. Now, this actually explains, it's an overnight train. This actually explains how cautiously it is being looked at, and there were reports that train tracks could have been targeted. In the night, these windows were closed down, and in order to prevent anybody from looking inside whether there are people or not. But in the morning, the authorities, the railway authorities, they opened these window shutters so that the light could come in, and then you could probably see outside as well.
An eerie silence has taken over Kyiv as heavy fighting is underway, and the Russian troops are inching closer to the capital. The platforms here are empty. No one except volunteers can be spotted.
We just arrived here after almost a 10-hour journey from Lviv. You can see the things that the relief items that we had spoken about, that they were being loaded onto the train. Now they're being offered with the help of the military. The current time, it's there on the board. The situation here is pretty grim. The railway station is almost empty. There is nobody to be found except for some media personnel who were traveling on the same train as well as ours. And the temperature here is currently -1. So the empty railway station and the empty train in itself is quite of a telling story. Anas Malik in Kyiv, Ukraine, for WION, World is One.
The impact of Russia's invasion is being felt the world over, especially in the global markets. The war has wiped out billions of dollars worth of global wealth. The losses are mounting. All leading exchanges continue to nosedive. If the war continues, the conflict will trigger food shortages worldwide. Our next report tells you how.
For the global economy, the war in Ukraine is bad news. The world was slowly recovering from the pandemic-induced slowdown. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine could derail the global economic recovery. Oil prices are the biggest pain point. Brent crude is the global benchmark for prices of crude. 1 barrel of Brent crude now costs close to $140, the highest since 2008. These prices are bad news for countries like India. India imports at least 75% of its oil needs. If the cost of crude remains this high, India's import bill could shoot past the 100 billion mark. Tough days lie ahead. The West is considering sanctions on Russian oil exports. Europe could soon make a move. If that happens, oil prices will rise even further.
We have to get rid of the dependency of Russian gas, oil and coal. I know the two of us agree on this. The Commission will be coming forward with proposals tomorrow, and there are 3 main pillars. One is the diversification of supply away from Russia and towards reliable suppliers.
Global markets are already spooked by that prospect. Across continents, leading exchanges crashed. America's Dow has been in the red for 4 weeks. Pan-Europe exchange stocks, Europe 600, fell by close to 2%. Asian stocks were hammered too. Last week, Indian investors lost more wealth than Ukraine's GDP. Their losses have now exceeded $66 billion. The consequences of the war in Ukraine will be felt beyond the exchanges. The International Monetary Fund has issued a grim warning. It said the sanctions on Russia will have a severe impact on the global economy. The World Bank, too, isn't optimistic. It has called the war an economic catastrophe. David Malpass, the president of the World Bank, has raised an alarm over food prices. Both Russia and Ukraine are leading food producers. The conflict is threatening the global food supply. Already, prices of key commodities have hit record levels. If the war continues, there could be a major shortage of essentials like wheat. The impact will be felt worldwide.
Today, about 30% of wheat comes from these two countries. 20% of maize, corn, comes from these two countries. And about 80% of sunflower oil comes from these two countries. So the impact of this crisis is worldwide.
The conflict in Ukraine is now spilling beyond the borders of Europe. The longer it continues, the more devastating it will be for the global economy.
When the Russians reach the doorsteps of Kyiv, they will have two options: march in or lay siege. If Russia wants to topple Volodymyr Zelensky, they will have to march in. But that is easier said than done. Thousands of civilians are still based in Kyiv. Many of them are armed. They have huge stockpiles of Molotov cocktails. And then you have the Ukrainian army itself. Hundreds of citizens have enlisted in the last 10 days, so the battle for Kyiv is likely to be a meat grinder. Many experts are worried about urban warfare. What does that mean? Street-to-street fighting, every intersection, every alley, every city square could become a battleground. And this is where Ukraine will have an advantage. They know the layout, they know the blind spots, the shortcuts. On the other hand, the Russian soldiers will be fighting blind. So Vladimir Putin is planning an alternate strategy. He is planning to recruit specialists from Syria. That is what the Wall Street Journal says. Syrians have been fighting a civil war for more than 10 years. They have aced urban warfare. And since 2015, Vladimir Putin has been supporting Bashar al-Assad's regime. And now he wants repayment. Reports say Russia is recruiting Syrian fighters for $200 to $300. Some of them are already in Russia. The question is, when does Putin want to unleash them? Strategically, now is not the time. The Russian military convoy is still stuck outside the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Urban warfare has not started yet. Having said that, this move does reveal the Russian president's end game. He is preparing for stiff resistance in Kyiv. He is preparing for street-to-street fighting. Does Ukraine have a plan of action? They too have foreign help. Ukraine has invited trained fighters from around the world. They have promised visa-free entry, weapons, monetary help. How many fighters have signed up so far? Around 16,000, according to the Ukrainian president.
Ukraine has started welcoming foreign volunteers who are coming to our country. The first of 16,000 are coming to defend our liberty and life, and of everyone. I'm sure it will be successful.
Zelensky did not reveal where these fighters are coming from, but reports indicate a global campaign. Veterans are flying in from the US, Britain, Canada, even Japan. Have governments okayed this mission? Not all of them. Some countries have banned the use of mercenaries like Australia and Germany. It is illegal for their citizens to fight abroad. What about the United States? It is not illegal for Americans to fight abroad, but the State Department did warn against it. Their latest advisory is level 4. In other words, do not travel. Despite this warning, dozens of US veterans are leaving for Ukraine. But the bulk of the fighting still depends on Ukrainian fighters. Even before the war, Ukraine had absorbed multiple armed groups in the country, some of them controversial, like the Azov Army. Azov Army is a right-wing militia of 900 fighters. In 2014, they were integrated into Ukraine's National Guard. But not everyone accepted this move. The US, for instance, refused to train the Azov Army until 2016. This video should tell you why. It was posted by Ukraine's National Guard. What does it show? Azov fighters greasing their bullets with pig fat because they are planning to fight the Muslim Chechen fighters. And that is another foreign group fighting in Ukraine, the Chechen army. It is commanded by Ramzan Kadyrov, who says 10,000 fighters are deployed in Ukraine. Now, this is no ordinary battalion. The Chechen special forces are ruthless and precise, which is why their role has come under scrutiny. Now, some Western analysts say it is propaganda. The Chechen fighters are not on the ground, that they are being used to drum up fears. Either way, Ukrainians are not backing down. Syrians, Chechens, special forces, whatever Russia is planning, Ukraine has one response, and that is spirited resistance. Our final story for this evening is about memes. Not just any memes, but those being exchanged between Ukraine and Russia. You see, the two countries are also in the middle of an information warfare. They are fighting it out on social media to ensure that their narrative overrides the story being told by the other side. And in this quest for social media supremacy, both Russia and Ukraine have come up with the most creative and lethal memes. Our next report brings you the best of the lot.
What comes to your mind when you think about weapons of war? Missiles? Gun machines? Perhaps nukes? What about memes? They are usually funny and seemingly unharmful. But memes can be as damaging as missiles and machine guns when it comes to information warfare. Russia versus Ukraine is no exception. It is about peddling propaganda, putting out one's narrative more convincingly and creatively. Both sides are on the offensive. They are bombing each other on social media, and memes have become the weapon of choice. Sample this one. Types of headaches, it reads: migraine, hypertension, stress, and living next to Russia. This meme was fired from Ukraine's official Twitter account. The internet was in splits. Soon, Russia retaliated. Dear Ukraine, the tweet goes, the red wine headache, aka RWH, has you confused. Choose your wines carefully. Order from Russia's Crimea. Absolutely lethal. Supporters of the two countries have joined the meme war. This one has put the two presidents on a call. Hey, want to hear a joke? Asks Zelensky. Go ahead, says Putin. Kyiv. I don't get it. That's right, you don't. Another one says Ukraine is trying to goad the US into World War III. Memes have taken the center stage in this war, and they are being fired at every possible stakeholder. This one is directed towards Zelensky. His growing global popularity is being compared to that of Kyiv mayor Vitaly Klitschko. Appears to be like the cat waiting in the wings. Here, SpongeBob is the Russian army, clearly confused between commands and common sense, it seems. All of these posts are getting a lot of attention. They are being shared, forwarded, and retweeted. Basically, the memes are doing their job. You know, this information warfare isn't typical to this war. In fact, it's not even new. Information has long been weaponized. During the Second World War, for example, Western and Nazi forces would airdrop targeted templates into enemy territory. They were meant to win over people of the opposing side. These memes are no different. Ever since tensions escalated between the two sides, the social media handles of Ukraine and Russia have been buzzing. We can't say who's winning the military warfare, but Ukraine seems to have the lead in the war being fought on the West-owned social media platforms. Here, Zelensky is being painted as the better leader, one who enjoys the support of his family, his troops, and the world. In another tweet, parallels are being drawn between Hitler and Putin. In short, Ukraine is being painted as the underdog, the symbol of resistance. And Zelensky as the new hero the world is rallying behind.
With that, it's a wrap on this edition. We're leaving you with Gravitas images. Thanks very much for watching.
Будь ласка, журналісти, крок назад. Один крок назад. Вірний чоловік, Амінь.